They weren't supposed to open that door. The Union soldiers in Burke County thought they were just clearing another abandoned plantation in the final days of the war. But when their axes shattered the iron hinges and the darkness spilled into the hallway of Thornhill Estate, the smell hit them first. Damp stone, human sweat, and something older. Something that smelled like fear left to rot. Inside were 23 children. Their eyes reflected the torchlight like trapped animals, pale green flecked with gold, impossible to mistake. Their cheekbones sharp as if chiseled, their hair a fiery auburn that did not belong in Georgia's soil. The soldiers staggered back because none of them could explain what they were seeing. Children with the same face, the same blood, the same mark of a woman they had never met but whose presence filled that room. When the eldest child, a girl no older than 13, spoke, the men who had seen blood and death on countless battlefields felt their stomachs turn. "Mistress says we are her legacy. We cannot leave because we are her blood." What does that mean? Legacy. Blood. The soldiers never spoke of it again. The official reports mention Thornhill only once, tucked away in a private letter, marked confidential, buried for a century. The plantation itself disappeared from county records as though it had been scrubbed from existence. Ask locals today about Thornhill and you'll get blank stares, nervous laughter, or sudden silence, as though the land itself remembers, but the people have chosen to forget. But you, watching this right now, don't get to look away, because once you hear what happened at Thornhill, you'll understand why whole families, whole towns conspired to bury this story. You'll understand the kind of control that doesn't just chain bodies but chains generations. This is not just a story about a widow keeping her land afloat. This is about Catherine Danforth Thornhill, the woman who stared ruin in the face in 1847 and decided to carve her own survival out of flesh and blood. A woman who turned her estate into a laboratory, who rewrote the rules of ownership, twisting family, power and biology into one monstrous design. And if you think this is only about one twisted plantation mistress, think again. What Catherine built was not an anomaly. It was a prototype, a mirror of a darker principle the powerful have used for centuries. That control is most absolute when it is not enforced by whips or chains, but by blood, identity, and the rewriting of truth itself. So I need to know before we continue. Where are you watching from? What town, what state, what corner of America are you in right now? Drop it in the comments, because when you know the buried history of your land, you start seeing what else has been hidden, and make no mistake, your land has secrets. Now lean closer. Imagine the winter of 1847, Burke County, Georgia. A funeral has just ended. A 28-year-old widow stands at the edge of a collapsing empire. Her husband lies in the frozen clay, his debts heavier than his coffin. The estate is failing, creditors are circling, the soil itself is exhausted. By every law of the South, Catherine Thornhill is supposed to fold, sell off what's left, retreat into the background as a dependent relic of her father's wealth. But Catherine does not retreat. She does not accept the humiliation of failure. In the sleepless hours of that February, a plan takes shape in her mind. Cold, mathematical, obscene. A plan not whispered, not suggested, but written in cipher, drawn in diagrams like a farmer charting livestock. She doesn't call it breeding, she calls it cultivation. She doesn't write of children, she writes of seedlings. She doesn't name the men she selects, she names them rootstock, ever. I word calculated, every euphemism a shield to disguise the truth even from herself. This is where the descent begins, not in violence, not in rage, but in logic. A woman looking at dwindling numbers in an account book and deciding, if I cannot buy workers, I will create them. If the market denies me, I will outwit the market. If nature gives me land that no longer yields, I will use flesh as soil. Tell me, are you ready to see how far she went? Because from this point forward, every step leads deeper into a nightmare most men cannot stomach, and once you hear it, you can never unknow it. February of 1847 was a cruel season in Burke County. The ground had hardened under frost, the air sharp enough to cut the lungs. Inside Thornhill Estate, silence pressed down on every room. Catherine Danforth Thornhill had buried her husband only days before, but mourning did not soften her. The funeral black she wore was not grief, it was armor. Jonathan Thornhill had left her more than a name. He left her ruin. The estate was drowning in debt, the cotton fields exhausted, the enslaved workforce stripped bare by years of sales to cover gambling losses. Where there had once been over 40 workers, only 31 remained, 11 men, 13 women, and 7 children. Hungry faces stared at her from the quarters, waiting for her next move. The overseer, a man more loyal to his pay than to any mistress, whispered openly that the land itself was cursed. Every widow in her position was expected to surrender, sell the land, sell the people, retreat into her father's house in Augusta, and fade into the background of Georgia's old families. But Catherine was not like other women. Her pride was forged in the Danforth line, merchants who had clawed their way into the ranks of the elite by refusing to bow. Dependence, failure, submission, these were words Catherine could not tolerate. And so, when others would have prayed for mercy, Catherine sharpened her mind like a blade. The account books spread before her at candlelight became battlegrounds. Every column of numbers was an enemy she refused to let conquer her. It was in these sleepless nights that her infamous idea first took root. She did not frame it as cruelty. She framed it as survival, as efficiency, as inevitability. If she could not buy strength, she would grow it. If she could not command loyalty, she would breed it, and if the law said ownership ended with emancipation or sale, she would ensure no escape was possible, because her future workforce would be hers in blood, as much her descendants as her property. This was no passing thought. Catherine recorded it. In a locked journal, she began what she called her cultivation records. Written in a cipher of agricultural language, she mapped out an experiment that would stretch across generations. She envisioned children raised not merely as labor, but as extensions of herself, the perfect union of ownership and legacy. Her first choice was Isaac, 24 years old, broad-shouldered, steady-eyed, born on Thornhill soil. He was known among the others for his quiet strength, a man who carried burdens without complaint. Catherine saw him not as a man, but as rootstock. In March of 1847, while the plantation slept, she summoned him to the main house. What passed between them that night was reduced in her journal to 6 words: first planting completed, weather clear and mild. 3 weeks later, she summoned him again, then again. By April, she recorded with the same cold detachment she used for cotton: initial cultivation successful, anticipate harvest in December. A child, her child, already taking shape within her body, not the heir of her dead husband, but the seed of her plan. But Catherine was not careless. She knew the danger of scandal. A child born too long after Jonathan's death would ignite whispers, lawsuits, ruin, so she crafted her deception with precision. To the midwife she lied smoothly, claiming Jonathan had been strong enough for intimacy shortly before his final illness. To the community she spoke of frailty, of grief, of premature birth, every detail rehearsed, every risk calculated. Only one person saw through her, her stepson, Richard Thornhill, 16 years old, sharp-minded and dangerous precisely because he was not blinded by her authority. Richard knew the dates did not align. He knew his fat in her had been near death when Catherine claimed conception, and in his suspicion he began to watch her more closely than anyone else dared. It was Richard who noticed Isaac's quiet arrivals at the main house after dusk. It was Richard who listened at doors, piecing together fragments of Catherine's secret, and it was Richard who, in his curiosity, discovered the locked drawer in her desk and the journal that should never have been read. There, on the cracked leather pages, he saw the true face of his stepmother, not grieving widow, not fragile mistress, but architect of a system colder than any whip. A breeder of flesh, mapping human lives as one would breed cattle or hounds. From that moment forward, Richard was no longer simply her stepson. He was her threat. And Catherine Thornhill was not a woman who tolerated threats. Richard Thornhill had always lived in the shadow of suspicion. To him, Catherine was never truly family. She had entered the household when he was only 5, a replacement for the mother who had died giving him life. He saw her as an intruder, cloaked in fine dresses and practiced smiles. But until the spring of 1847, his dislike was only the quiet bitterness of a boy. Then came the whispers behind closed doors, the late-night summons of Isaac, the flicker of candlelight in Catherine's study when the rest of the house slept. Richard noticed what others ignored, and what he could not ignore began to consume him. His father had barely clung to consciousness in his final weeks. Jonathan Thornhill was not the man to father a child in January, and yet, by June, Catherine was visibly expecting. One night, pressing himself against the wall of the library, Richard overheard her speaking with the midwife, Miriam Grayson. Her tone was level, confident, rehearsed. She claimed conception in January, mere weeks before Jonathan's death. The midwife did not challenge her. Why would she? Catherine's name carried weight, and when lies come wrapped in wealth, they are harder to question. But Richard knew the truth. He had been there in the sick room, holding his father's hand, wiping his fevered brow. Jonathan had been incapable of intimacy, which meant Catherine's child belonged to someone else, and Richard suspected who. He began to follow Isaac with his eyes. He noted the hours when Isaac was called away from the quarters. He noticed how Catherine addressed him, not with the clipped commands she used on the others, but in complete sentences, measured, deliberate, almost like conversation. By July, Richard's certainty hardened. Isaac was the father. The realization sickened him, but it was the discovery of her journal that froze his blood. Catherine's study was her sanctum, the one place Richard was forbidden. Yet when she travelled to town, his curiosity overcame him. He found the locked drawer, the leather-bound book, the strange substitutions that at first looked like harmless farm notes. But Richard had a sharp mind, sharper than Catherine had counted on. Within days he cracked the cipher, and there, in trembling candlelight, he read the words that would mark him forever. Seedlings, rootstock, plantings, harvests. It was all there, an entire blueprint of control spanning decades. Catherine had not merely broken a taboo, she had systematized it. She charted genetic traits as if she were breeding horses, calculating strength, temperament, loyalty, obedience. She planned not just for herself, but for generations of Thornhills yet unborn, a private empire of flesh bound not by law, but by blood. Richard copied what he could. His hands shook so badly he could hardly steady the pen. Here was proof of her depravity, a weapon to use against her. But Catherine was no fool. That evening, over supper, she fixed him with those pale green eyes and asked with unnerving calm, "Richard, have you been in my study?" The words cut like a knife. His denial was clumsy, his voice too tight. She smiled faintly and carved her meat with precision. "I keep certain papers locked for good reason. If someone were to pry into what does not concern them, it would be an unforgivable betrayal. Family loyalty is everything, Richard. Without it, we are nothing but animals tearing at each other." The meaning was clear. She knew. She didn't need to accuse him outright. Her mastery lay in implication. Richard burned his copies that night, terrified she might discover them, but he could not burn the knowledge in his mind. He saw now what Catherine was, not simply a widow clawing for survival, but a predator cloaked in civility, a woman willing to poison truth itself to secure her empire. And poison, literal poison, was the next weapon she chose. Richard's body began to betray him in the autumn. Fatigue gnawed at him. His appetite vanished, his head ached, his muscles weakened, his stomach twisted in pain. Catherine played the attentive guardian, preparing his meals herself, fetching tonics from Augusta. The midwife pronounced it consumption, that wasting disease so common in young men. But Richard had read too much. He knew the signs of arsenic. He knew he was being unmade one spoonful at a time. He was 16 years old, trapped in the house of a woman who smiled while she murdered him. And Catherine Thornhill, she smiled because she had already calculated his end. By October of 1847, Richard Thornhill was a shadow of himself. Once pale and sharp-eyed, he now lay weak in bed, his skin waxen, his movements sluggish. Catherine hovered over him with the performance of maternal care. She fed him soups, tonics, and powders dissolved in wine. To any visitor, it looked like devotion. But Richard knew better. Every mouthful carried him closer to the grave. The cruelty of it was not just in the poisoning itself, it was in the intimacy. Catherine did not send servants to administer the doses. She did it with her own hands, spooning broth into his mouth, whispering that he must rest, that she would take care of everything. It was murder wrapped in tenderness, as if she enjoyed watching him fade beneath her careful touch. He tried to fight back. His mind, though clouded, still sought escape. He wrote a letter to his grandfather, Theodore Danforth, in Augusta. In it he described everything, the journal, the breeding plan, the poisoning. It was his last hope, that someone beyond Thornhill's walls might intervene before Catherine's design consumed him entirely. The act of writing drained him. His hand shook so badly that every line wavered like the scrawl of a child. It took him 3 days to finish. He sealed the letter and entrusted it to Pearl, a house servant barely 12 years old. Her wide eyes betrayed fear when he begged her to carry it to the post in town. "Please," he whispered, "you must not tell her." But fear is a sharper chain than iron. Pearl delivered the letter into Catherine's hands. That night, Catherine entered Richard's room, the letter already burned to ash in her fireplace. She sat beside his bed, smoothing his damp hair from his forehead, her voice low, almost tender. "You are very ill, Richard. The fever has taken your mind. You imagine things that are not real. It is a mercy you won't suffer much longer." Richard's body trembled, but not from fever, from despair. He had gambled his last piece of strength on a letter, and Catherine had snuffed it out as easily as she snuffed candles in the hallway. By November, he could no longer rise from bed. His legs gave way when he tried to stand. His breath rattled in his chest. The overseer stayed away from the house. The servants obeyed Catherine without question. He was utterly isolated. Still, his mind clung to fragments of resistance. He replayed the words of Catherine's journal in his head, trying to burn them into memory. He whispered them into the mattress, as if the wood itself might remember after he was gone. Perhaps one day someone would unearth them. Perhaps the truth could not be buried forever. But Catherine planned more thoroughly than Richard could ever imagine. She had already arranged for his death to appear natural. Consumption, the wasting disease, would be the official cause. The midwife, loyal and discreet, was ready to sign her name to the record. Catherine would play the grieving stepmother, dressed in black, her face veiled with tears, and the community would nod solemnly, never suspecting the rot beneath the surface. On December 3rd, 1847, 3 weeks before his 17th birthday, Richard Thornhill died. His body was thin as kindling, his skin stretched tight over bone. Dr. Pritchard of Wesborough recorded the death as consumption and marveled at the speed with which the boy had wasted away. Catherine thanked him with quiet dignity, a widow bowed by yet another cruel stroke of fate. 4 days later, the illusion was complete. Catherine gave birth to a son. She named him Jonathan after her late husband and claimed he was premature. Few dared to question the timing. Those who might have wondered said nothing. After all, appearances mattered more than truth, and with Richard buried in cold earth, nothing stood between Catherine and her plan. The heir she had invented was in her arms, his pale green eyes proof of her design. The first seed had sprouted, and Thornhill's legacy had begun to grow. The funeral veil had barely settled over Thornhill Estate before Catherine began her true work. To the community she played her role with flawless precision. The grieving widow, the tragic stepmother who had lost a promising young boy to illness, the mother who had birthed a frail, premature son destined to carry on her late husband's name. Pity shielded her. Respectability concealed her. Behind those masks, her ambition sharpened like a hidden blade. With Richard gone, there was no one left to question her, no child from Jonathan's first marriage to complicate inheritance, no watchful eyes in the library piecing together her cipher. Catherine stood alone as mistress of Thornhill, and she intended to use that freedom ruthlessly. Her journal, the cultivation records, thickened with entries. She charted her newborn Jonathan as seedling one. She noted his eye color, bone structure, and health with the cold precision of a breeder recording foals. She compared him to Isaac, his father, and to herself, weighing what she considered the strengths of each. Catherine was not sentimental. To her, this child was not simply a son, it was proof of concept, evidence that her plan could bear fruit. But one child was not enough. She needed a generation, a lineage, an entire workforce bound by her blood. And so she expanded the program. Isaac remained her primary rootstock, but she began selecting others from the enslaved men on the estate. Each choice was deliberate. Broad shoulders, steady temperaments, quick reflexes, sharp eyes. She studied them as a farmer studies livestock, reducing humanity to traits on a ledger. Catherine did not call these encounters what they were. She cloaked them in euphemism: second planting, cross-strain, new stock. She convinced herself this was science, innovation, survival, but in truth it was domination perfected, the body itself reduced to soil for her ambition. The quarters buzzed with unease. Whispered rumors spread that the mistress called men to the house at night, that women who served her directly carried secrets too heavy to speak. Yet fear bound them. Catherine ruled not through the whip, but through something subtler, the knowledge that she saw everything, planned everything, controlled everything. To resist her was to risk disappearance. To obey was to survive. By 1850, 3 years into her project, Catherine had birthed 2 more children, a daughter with Isaac and another son with a man named Elijah. Both bore the telltale signs: those pale green eyes, that sharp bone structure, the Thornhill mark. Neighbors praised her for her resilience, for producing heirs despite tragedy. Few dared whisper about the uncanny similarity between these children and certain men in the quarters. Appearances were everything, and Catherine knew how to maintain them. The estate itself began to shift. Where once the fields had been her priority, now the house became the true heart of Thornhill. Rooms were converted into nurseries, halls filled with the cries of children who were neither fully free nor fully enslaved. Catherine raised them with calculated favoritism, granting them privileges denied to others: softer clothes, fuller meals, lessons in obedience laced with hints of superiority. She was crafting not just workers, but a hierarchy of flesh, children who would one day believe their loyalty to her was written in their blood. And the enslaved mothers, their voices were swallowed by fear. Some wept in silence as their children were claimed not as their own, but as Catherine's. Others hardened themselves, surviving by erasing their pain. Catherine recorded none of this in her journal. For her, these women were not mothers but vessels, soil in which she planted her seed. By the middle of the decade, Thornhill Estate no longer resembled the failing plantation Catherine had inherited. It pulsed with an unnatural vitality, an experiment unfolding in secret. Visitors remarked on her uncanny children, all of them striking, all of them bearing a resemblance that could not be denied. Catherine smiled politely, deflecting questions with charm and vague references to family resemblance. Behind her eyes, calculation never ceased. She had transformed survival into something darker, legacy engineered through control of the most intimate kind. The plantation was no longer dying, it was mutating. And no one outside those walls suspected how deep the mutation would run. By 1855, Thornhill Estate had become unrecognizable from the struggling plantation Catherine had inherited 8 years earlier. The cotton fields still yielded enough to maintain appearances, but Catherine's true harvest was growing not in rows of soil, but in the bodies of her children. There were 6 of them now, 3 sons, 3 daughters, ranging from toddler to 8 years old. To outsiders, they appeared the natural heirs of the Thornhill line, a miracle of resilience after so much tragedy. Neighbors marveled at how Catherine, widowed so young, had managed to produce such striking offspring. Each child bore some uncanny resemblance to her, the same pale green eyes, the same angular cheekbones. The whispers that their features also echoed those of certain enslaved men on the estate never reached her doorstep. No one dared confront a Danforth. Inside the estate, however, the truth could not be hidden. The enslaved women who had carried these children endured their loss in silence, watching them grow up in nurseries instead of quarters. Catherine raised them herself, denying their mothers even the comfort of nursing. She declared it necessary for their refinement. In her journal, she wrote, "Bloodlines must be cultivated from infancy. Sentiment weakens the harvest." The children were trained not only in obedience but in hierarchy. Catherine allowed them privileges other enslaved children never knew: shoes in winter, schooling in letters and numbers, sweet preserves at the table. But these favors came with constant reminders of their difference. "You are mine," she told them, her voice calm, her hand resting lightly on their shoulders. "You are Thornhill. The rest are soil. You must never forget." The result was unsettling. The older children, especially the boy Jonathan, began to see themselves as set apart, superior. They lauded small privileges over the others, enforcing Catherine's divisions with childish cruelty. Games in the yard turned into rituals of dominance, where Thornhill's chosen mocked the field children for their ragged clothes or empty stomachs. Catherine never intervened. She observed, recorded, and occasionally rewarded. To her, these were not childish squabbles, but the early signs of loyalty to her vision. Isaac, the man who had fathered her first two children, began to change as well. Once quiet and steady, he now carried himself with a haunted weight. He no longer looked Catherine in the eye when summoned. He obeyed, but each visit to the main house seemed to carve more of him away. In her journal, Catherine noted this with irritation. Rootstock deteriorating, useful traits preserved in seedlings, replacement may soon be necessary. Her cold detachment extended even to the enslaved community's grief, when a woman named Dinah, forced into Catherine's breeding scheme, wept openly after being denied her newborn daughter. Catherine summoned her to the study. "You must not confuse yourself with ownership," she told her, voice sharp as glass. "The child is not yours. She belongs to Thornhill, to me. You are soil, Dinah. Soil does not claim the seed." Dinah left the room broken, her tears swallowed into silence. Catherine recorded the exchange in her ledger with satisfaction. Resistance quelled, order maintained. By the late 1850s, Thornhill had become something more than a plantation. It was a controlled environment, a closed system where Catherine dictated not only labor, but lineage. Visitors remarked on the strange harmony of the place, how little unrest it seemed to suffer compared to neighboring estates. They assumed it was her iron discipline. They did not see that beneath the surface, Thornhill was not at peace but under experiment, every life a variable in Catherine's design. The children of Thornhill's first generation grew tall, their features unmistakably hers. They were not simply heirs to her fortune, but living proof of her theory, that ownership could be inscribed in blood, that power could be cultivated as carefully as crops. Catherine's pride swelled with each passing year. She had weathered ruin, outlived her enemies, buried her threats. And in the quiet of her study, she began sketching the next phase of her plan, the second generation. Her vision stretched far beyond her own lifetime now. She imagined a lineage of dozens, perhaps hundreds, all carrying her mark, all bound by a loyalty that no emancipation, no law, no outside power could sever. For Catherine Danforth Thornhill, death was no longer an enemy. She had found her path to immortality through the blood of those she claimed as hers. And as the decade darkened toward war, Thornhill's true horror was only beginning to take shape. By 1859, the air in Georgia was heavy with talk of disunion. In town meetings, newspapers, and taverns, men argued fiercely over states' rights, abolition, and the looming possibility of war. Planters sharpened their rhetoric as much as their blades. Yet at Thornhill Estate, Catherine Danforth Thornhill remained calm. Where others fretted over politics, she saw only another variable to be controlled, another storm to be harnessed. Her seedlings, now numbering 9, were reaching adolescence. Jonathan, the eldest, was 12, tall, sharp-boned, with those unmistakable pale green eyes that seemed to pierce through anyone who met them. Catherine adored him, not as a mother adores a child, but as a scientist admires her most successful specimen. He carried both her intelligence and Isaac's strength. He was, in her words, the perfected union of root and seed. The children's presence on the estate was impossible to ignore. They moved differently from the others, confident, entitled, conscious of their favored status. Catherine had cultivated this distinction with ruthless care. She placed them above the enslaved children in every visible way. Better clothing, richer meals, books to read, lessons in speech and etiquette. She whispered into their ears at night, planting her doctrine as firmly as she had planted her blood. You are Thornhill, you are mine, you are destined. Yet with adolescence came volatility. Jonathan's pride hardened into cruelty. He began striking the younger children when they disobeyed him, mimicking Catherine's authority. His half-sister Anne learned to manipulate the others with a sharp tongue and calculated lies. Even the quieter ones displayed unsettling instincts, stealing food not out of hunger but out of pleasure, tormenting animals for sport. Catherine recorded these behaviors with clinical detachment, never intervening unless they threatened her order. Dominance displays are necessary, she wrote in her ledger. The strong must rule the weak. Outside Thornhill, rumours swirled. Neighbours whispered about the uncanny resemblance of Catherine's children to men in the quarters. A few suspected more than coincidence, but Catherine's social standing, reinforced by the Danforth name, protected her from direct accusation. Those who muttered too loudly found themselves invited to supper at Thornhill, where Catherine's poise, wit, and well-practiced grief over her tragic losses disarmed them. She understood society better than any of them. Appearances outweighed truth, and wealth silenced doubt. Still, Catherine recognized danger in the winds of politics. The talk of emancipation, the agitation of abolitionists, the possibility of war, these were threats to her system. If slavery ended, what would become of her harvest? She did not panic. She adapted. In her journal, she outlined a new stage of the project: self-sufficiency. If the institution collapses, she wrote, Thornhill must endure. My children are not merely heirs, they are the estate itself. Bound to me by blood, they will not scatter as freedmen scatter. They will remain. They will multiply. They will outlast this republic if need be. She began training Jonathan and the older children in skills beyond plantation life: accounting, reading ledgers, managing supplies. She had them sit in on her dealings with merchants, listening as she haggled and manipulated. She did not raise them for war. She raised them for dominion. Whatever the Union or Confederacy decreed, Thornhill would survive, carried in their veins. Meanwhile, the enslaved community lived in silent dread. They knew what the neighbors did not. They saw their children taken from them, absorbed into Catherine's brood. They heard the whispers at night, the cries behind closed doors. And, though some dreamed of escape, Catherine's control was ironclad. She monitored movements, punished suspicion, and exploited fear. To resist was to disappear. By the winter of 1860, as South Carolina seceded and Georgia edged toward the same, Catherine stood at her window and watched her children playing in the yard. Jonathan held a stick like a scepter, ordering the younger ones into line. Anne corrected their posture with a sharp slap. The others obeyed without question. Catherine smiled faintly and turned back to her ledger. The nation might tear itself apart, but Thornhill was ready. Her legacy was no longer bound to the laws of men. It was written in flesh. And in the shadow of war, Catherine Danforth Thornhill believed she had already conquered eternity. The war came to Burke County in whispers first, letters carried from Savannah, rumors drifting down the river from Augusta, the dull thud of distant drums that no one could quite place. By 1861, Georgia had torn itself from the Union, and the young men of Westboro marched off in grey uniforms with flags fluttering proudly above their heads. Mothers wept, fathers boasted, and the county's elite spoke of glory. But at Thornhill, Catherine Danforth Thornhill felt none of this patriotism. For her, war was neither tragedy nor triumph. It was a crucible, and she knew crucibles refine only those prepared to endure the fire. Cotton prices surged in the first year, and Catherine exploited it with brutal precision. Her children, as she called them, were trained not just for labor, but for control. Jonathan, now 13, oversaw the cotton gins with an authority that startled visitors. When questioned about his age, Catherine dismissed it with a sly smile. "He is precocious, like his father," she would say. Few dared push further. The enslaved population groaned under the weight of her ambition. Every ounce of energy was extracted for profit. Catherine watched them with hawk-like attention, rewarding obedience, punishing hesitation. Those who resisted were broken quietly, often removed from the quarters altogether. No one spoke of where they went. Fear was a stronger leash than chains. Yet the war pressed closer. By 1862, inflation devoured profits. Confederate requisitions stripped plantations of food, livestock, and men. Catherine adapted. She hoarded supplies, bribed officials, and used her children as spies within her own community, listening for whispers of rebellion. Jonathan and Anne became her most trusted enforcers, their loyalty to her absolute. They were no longer merely children. They were instruments. Still, the storm grew. News of Union victories reached even to the most isolated farms. Enslaved people fled northward in growing numbers, but Thornhill was different. The enslaved there did not flee, not because they were content, but because Catherine had twisted the very concept of escape. She reminded them that her children were their children too. Blood blurred the boundaries of bondage. "You cannot run from yourselves," she told them coldly. "Even if freedom comes, you will never be free of Thornhill. It is in your veins." The cruelty of this logic cut deeper than whips. Some believed her, others despaired. A few plotted quietly, but none succeeded. Catherine's network of eyes and ears was too complete. The estate became a closed system, an experiment sealed against the chaos of war. By 1863, when Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation reached the South, Catherine laughed. "Words on paper mean nothing," she wrote in her ledger. "A law cannot erase blood. My harvest is not subject to proclamation. My legacy cannot be signed away." She began accelerating her program, pairing her older children with enslaved women. Jonathan, only 15, was already a father by then. Anne, too, was pressed into the role of breeder, her pregnancies disguised beneath Catherine's manipulations of social rumor. The line expanded, unchecked, as the nation collapsed into carnage. Union troops drew nearer in 1864. The thunder of war no longer came as rumor, but as cannon fire rolling across the horizon. Neighbors fled westward with their slaves, hoping to outrun Sherman's march. Catherine did not flee. She fortified. Thornhill's iron doors were locked, supplies were hidden. And the children, the pale-eyed, green-eyed offspring of her design, were gathered into the basements, trained to wait in silence, taught to see themselves as a chosen order who would outlive both North and South. When Union soldiers finally set foot in Burke County, they found plantations smoldering, families scattered, and chaos reigning, but Thornhill stood silent, shuttered, unyielding like a fortress of secrets. And behind those locked doors, Catherine Thornhill whispered to her brood, "This is the test. If Thornhill survives this fire, it will survive anything. You are my proof." It was a grey December morning in 1864 when the iron gates of Thornhill finally clanged open under the boots of the Union Army. Sherman's men, hardened by months of torching Georgia's countryside, had been warned about Catherine Danforth Thornhill. Some locals muttered of hidden caches of weapons, others of gold buried beneath the plantation's red soil, but none of them spoke of what truly lay inside. The soldiers approached the estate cautiously. The main house loomed like a mausoleum, white paint weathered and peeling, 6 columns standing sentinel like pale, rotting teeth. The grounds were eerily still, no livestock, no voices, only the slow creak of Spanish moss swaying in the wind. The overseer's cottage was deserted. Smoke no longer rose from the quarters. It was as if the plantation had held its breath, waiting for judgment. Inside, the house smelled of damp stone and sickness. Furniture stood neatly in place, but a film of dust suggested it had not been touched in weeks. Catherine herself appeared in the parlor, dressed in black, composed as though greeting guests rather than invaders. Her auburn hair was streaked with silver now, but her green eyes were as sharp as ever. "Gentlemen," she said calmly, "you'll find no resistance here. Thornhill belongs to history now." Her composure unsettled the men. They were used to terrified landowners begging for mercy, not widows standing like statues of marble. But it was not Catherine's words that would haunt them. It was what they found when they pried open the basement. The iron doors beneath the main house had been bolted shut, the lock fused by years of neglect or design. It took 3 men with rifles as levers to force them open. When the highwaymen guests finally screamed, a stench of mildew and sweat rolled out. Lanterns were lowered into the dark, their flickering light revealing shapes huddled together. At first, the soldiers thought they had stumbled upon some forgotten cargo, human contraband hidden from emancipation. But then the children raised their heads. 23 of them, boys and girls with pale green eyes glowing like cat's eyes in the lantern light. Skin tones ranging from deep brown to milk white, hair curling in shades of auburn, copper and gold. The resemblance between them was unmistakable. Cheekbones cut in the same sharp angles, lips pressed in the same severe lines. They were not siblings in the casual sense. They were manufactured replicas, stamped from a single mold. Catherine's mold. The eldest, a girl of 13, stepped forward. She was barefoot, her dress ragged, but her posture carried an unnatural poise. Her voice was steady, almost rehearsed. "Mistress says we are her legacy. We cannot leave because we are her blood." Veteran soldiers, men who had survived Shiloh and Atlanta, stumbled back, their faces pale. One vomited against the wall, another crossed himself feverishly, muttering that they had found hell's children. The Union captain demanded answers from Catherine. She did not flinch. She told him nothing, only smiled faintly, as though the horror before them was a mirror reflecting their own brutality. "Every nation breeds its heirs," she said coldly. "Why should Thornhill be different?" The soldiers documented the discovery in hurried notes, but their report was marked confidential, sealed away in regimental archives. No official record of Thornhill appeared in Burke County histories. It was easier to erase the estate than to explain it. The children were taken into custody, dispersed, sent north under the guise of war orphans. Some vanished in orphanages, others placed into households that never questioned their origins. But rumors followed them. Families who took them in whispered of their strange gazes, their unsettling maturity, the way they whispered Catherine's words as if reciting scripture. "Blood is destiny. Thornhill endures." And Catherine herself, she was never hanged, never tried. Some accounts say she slipped away in the chaos, vanishing into Augusta or Charleston under an assumed name. Others claim she remained in the ruins of Thornhill, a ghost wandering her barren fields. But what mattered was not whether Catherine lived or died. What mattered was that her design had escaped her walls. Those 23 children carried her vision into the world, and visions, once born, are not so easily buried. The war ended, but Thornhill did not die. Its walls may have burned, its mistress may have vanished, but its blood had already been carried out into the veins of the Republic. Those 23 children, Catherine's legacy, were dispersed like seeds cast into the wind, and as with all seeds, some withered, but some took root. In the chaos of Reconstruction, records were unreliable. Entire families disappeared into poverty or migration. Freedmen sought new lives, ex-Confederates hid in shame or rage, and orphans of every stripe crowded church steps and army barracks. Against this backdrop, Catherine's brood slipped quietly into the fabric of America. One boy, remembered by a Union chaplain only as Elias, was placed with a wealthy abolitionist family in Boston. They were charmed at first by his intelligence, his uncanny ability to mimic adult speech, his watchful green eyes. But within a year, the household grew uneasy. Elias kept journals filled with drawings of geometric breeding diagrams, much like the ones Catherine had sketched. He whispered to the other children in the house about destiny in the blood and the mother who never dies. When he was caught dissecting stray cats in the cellar, the family sent him away quietly, ashamed, erasing his presence from their family history. Another, a girl named Sarah, was absorbed into a farming family in Pennsylvania. She blended well for a time, working diligently in the fields, polite in church. But her foster mother confessed years later that Sarah had an unnerving hold over the boys in town. They followed her blindly, fought at her command, and stole for her pleasure. At 13, she had orchestrated a secret council of children where she demanded loyalty oaths sealed with drops of blood. By 16, she disappeared entirely, rumored to have boarded a train southward, searching for the ruins of Burke County. Not all survived. Disease, hunger, and violence claimed many in those brutal years, but enough endured to keep the whisper alive that Catherine's children walked among America's new citizens, carrying with them a philosophy darker than any sermon preached from pulpit or stump. The truth gnawed at those Union soldiers who had first opened Thornhill's basement. Some tried to forget. Others drank themselves into silence, but one, Lieutenant Samuel Brigham of the 34th Massachusetts, could not shake the image of those green-eyed children staring back at him like reflections of some inhuman experiment. He wrote letters to his wife describing nightmares in which Catherine appeared at his bedside, whispering that his own children were no longer his but hers. His journals, discovered after his death in 1872, spoke of the disease of bloodlines and his terror that Thornhill's brood would outlast the Union itself. Meanwhile, in Burke County, Thornhill Estate was erased from polite conversation. Local histories mentioned surrounding plantations, but Thornhill's name was omitted as if it had never existed. Maps quietly excluded it. The Danforth family in Augusta used their influence to ensure silence, preferring scandal buried over scandal revealed. Yet whispers endured among the black community. Stories passed down in quarters and churches spoke of the lady who bred her own slaves and the green-eyed children of the devil. To speak of Thornhill was to risk summoning its shadow, but the stories survived. They always do. And there were sightings. Reports in Georgia newspapers of the 1870s mentioned strangers with pale eyes stirring unrest among freedmen communities. In one case, a preacher was accused of inciting violence after declaring that freedom is an illusion, the true chains are in the blood. Witnesses said his eyes glowed green in the lamplight. In another, midwife swore she delivered a child with Catherine's features, though the mother was 3 generations removed from Thornhill. Bloodlines twist through time like roots beneath the soil, hidden, silent, but persistent. Catherine's genius, her monstrosity, was not merely in her cruelty, it was in her foresight. She knew that wars end, empires collapse, laws change, but blood endures, flesh carries memory. Her vision had escaped the basement, replicated in children who carried her ideology as naturally as their green eyes. By the 1880s, those children were adults. Some vanished into anonymity. Others carved strange legacies in towns and cities, binding others to them with charisma or cruelty. But wherever they went, Thornhill whispered through them, not as a place, not even as a person, but as an inheritance of control. And so the nightmare did not end when Union soldiers shut those basement doors. That was merely the beginning. By the 1890s, America was swelling with confidence. Railroads crisscrossed the land, factories belched smoke into new industrial skies, and cities grew like steel forests. The nation congratulated itself on progress, forgetting the scars of war beneath the surface. But shadows do not vanish with prosperity, they adapt, and Thornhill's shadow was no different. Catherine's brood, dispersed and disguised, had come of age. Their origins were erased in official records, but their eyes betrayed them, that same pale green, uncanny in its persistence. They surfaced in strange places, always close to power, always bending others to their will. One young man, whose name appears in Yale's 1887 admissions ledger as Jonathan T. Hall, stood out among his classmates. He excelled not through brilliance of study, but through dominance of personality. Classmates noted his magnetic presence, his ability to rally others into secrecy-bound circles. By graduation, he was rumored to have founded an underground society parallel to the well-known fraternities, one that preached a darker creed, blood above law, lineage above truth. Another, a woman in New Orleans named Marianne, entered society through marriage to a merchant twice her age. By the time she was 25, she had established a salon where influential men gathered, politicians, bankers, preachers. Witnesses later remarked that Marianne spoke little, but listened with terrifying intensity, as though studying her guests like pieces in a game. More than one man left her house visibly shaken, muttering about eyes that saw too much. Within a decade, her husband was dead, his fortune in her hands, and her gatherings continued under the guise of respectability. Patterns emerged. These descendants of Thornhill, whether in Boston, New Orleans, Charleston, or even New York, displayed the same traits: ambition without hesitation, charisma sharpened into control, an instinct to organize others into hierarchies. They did not merely survive, they infiltrated. They drifted into secret societies, fraternal orders, churches, and banks, not at the top immediately, but close enough to influence. always close enough. The coincidence was too much for some historians to ignore. A scattered handful of researchers in the early 20th century, antiquarians, folklorists, even amateur genealogists, stumbled upon strange records, multiple families across different states reporting green-eyed patriarchs or matriarchs who demanded loyalty oaths from their kin, who kept private journals written in ciphers, eerily similar to Catherine's. Yet each researcher who pursued the connection eventually fell silent. Some abandoned their projects abruptly. A few were found dead under circumstances officially labeled accidents. There is one letter, dated 1903, from a historian in Savannah to a colleague in Philadelphia. It reads, "I believe we are tracking a single bloodline originating in Burke County, Georgia, and extending now into circles of commerce and education. Their creed is not political, not religious, but biological. They believe domination is their inheritance. The name Thornhill appears nowhere, yet their eyes reveal them. Be careful, for these are not mere families but a design, and designs do not forgive discovery." The historian who wrote this was found drowned in the Savannah River a month later. His notes vanished. Catherine herself was gone by then. Whether buried, exiled, or preserved in whispered rumor hardly mattered. She had always planned for her body to fail, but her idea that power could be engineered, refined in flesh, transmitted through generations like a contagion, was alive, and her children, now adults with children of their own, carried the contagion forward. By the turn of the century, whispers of Thornhill had moved from folklore into the corridors of institutions. Fraternities at Ivy League schools, business lodges in New York, fraternal orders in Louisiana, each bore faint fingerprints of the doctrine: secrecy, hierarchy, blood-bound loyalty. Some dismissed these as the normal trappings of elite society, but others, looking closer, saw the echo of Catherine's basement: children arranged in rows, taught obedience and domination as if it were destiny. America was modernizing, electrifying, congratulating itself on democracy and progress. But beneath that veneer, Thornhill's brood had found new soil. No longer chained to one plantation, they were spreading into the bloodstream of the nation itself. And their mother's whisper guided them still. Family loyalty is everything. Without it, we are only animals tearing at each other. The new century belonged to the barons, Rockefeller's oil, Carnegie's steel, Morgan's banks. America bowed to money more than to politics, and power was measured in stock shares rather than acres of cotton. Yet within this gilded order, Thornhill's bloodline found a perfect refuge. They were never at the very top. Catherine's children lacked the sheer fortune of the Titans, but they threaded themselves beneath, attaching like roots to trunks. One became a discreet advisor to a railroad magnate, whispering strategies of labor control that bordered on cruelty. Another slipped into a banking firm, steering investments toward ventures that placed entire immigrant communities under financial leash. Their strength was not wealth itself, but the manipulation of those who held it. Secret lodges proliferated in the same period: the Freemasons, the Oddfellows, the countless fraternal orders that promised brotherhood while masking hierarchy. Thornhill descendants joined quietly, not as founders, but as infiltrators. They excelled in the rituals, the oaths, the endless obsession with lineage. Where others saw quaint tradition, they saw a vessel for Catherine's creed: loyalty sealed in blood. By the 1910s, the first American intelligence networks were forming, primitive, disorganized precursors to what would become the FBI and OSS. Here too, the brood drifted in. Their discipline, their secrecy, their calculated charisma fit perfectly in the shadows. Files from the era contain vague references to operatives with peculiar family ties, and agents whose loyalties seem hereditary rather than patriotic. The Thornhill vision had adapted. No longer confined to a plantation basement, it now wore the mask of modernity: suits instead of rags, boardrooms instead of fields, coded telegrams instead of whispered scripture. Yet at its heart, it remained unchanged: blood above law, lineage above truth, Thornhill above all. World War I was the crucible Catherine had imagined but never lived to see, a world reshaped not by fields and families but by trenches, espionage, and the machinery of death. For Thornhill's brood, it was an opportunity. Many of Catherine's descendants were of age by 1917 when America entered the war. Some enlisted openly, their green eyes glinting beneath helmets. Others took less visible roles, clerks in intelligence bureaus, translators in embassies, supply officers in Europe. Wherever secrecy was currency, they thrived. One descendant, a captain in the American Expeditionary Forces, earned notoriety for drilling his men with a severity bordering on cruelty. Soldiers later testified he spoke not of victory or patriotism, but of purity in the ranks, of strength refined through sacrifice. His name was quietly scrubbed from official reports after several of his subordinates died under questionable circumstances. Meanwhile, in Washington, a Thornhill woman employed in the Military Intelligence Division became known for her uncanny ability to detect disloyalty in colleagues. She organized covert loyalty circles among secretaries and clerks, demanding private oaths of silence. Her supervisors praised her discipline but grew wary when rumors spread that her group continued meeting after hours, reciting phrases about destiny and blood. The war ended, but for the Thornhill bloodline, it was only the beginning. The trenches had shown them that control was not merely personal or familial, it could be systemic, national, global. Where Catherine had bound a household, her descendants now dreamed of binding nations. And so, when the guns fell silent in 1918, Thornhill's children returned home not broken, but sharpened. They had tested their creed in mud and blood across the ocean and found it adaptable. The whisper endured, louder now. Thornhill is no place. Thornhill is inheritance. The roaring 20s crackled with jazz, neon, and unrestrained appetite. Cities swelled, fortunes rose overnight, and morality blurred into spectacle. To most Americans, it was an age of liberation. To the Thornhill bloodline, it was an age of recruitment. In New York, a descendant who called himself Daniel Thorne quietly ran a speakeasy on the Lower East Side. The alcohol was secondary. What mattered were the private rooms upstairs, where young men of wealth and influence were drawn into midnight gatherings. There, under dim light, Daniel spoke of loyalty stronger than law, of families destined to rule, initiates left believing they had joined an exclusive fraternity. They never realized they had stepped into Catherine's design. Elsewhere, a woman named Celeste Thornhill made herself the center of a Harlem literary salon. Poets and musicians adored her. Patrons whispered she possessed a gaze that could strip pretenses bare. She published nothing herself, yet her salon produced voices that defined the decade. Later, scholars noted an eerie similarity in the themes of those writers: bloodlines, inheritance, chosen legacies. Celeste's hand was invisible but undeniable. Then came 1929. The stock market collapse shattered illusions of endless prosperity. Panic swept banks, farms, and families alike. Yet Thornhill descendants seemed almost prepared. Some pulled their money weeks before the crash. Others acquired ruined businesses at pennies on the dollar, consolidating power while the nation despaired. It was not luck. It was discipline. The same cold foresight Catherine had wielded in the fields of Georgia now applied to capital and crisis. Where most saw collapse, Thornhill saw opportunity. As breadlines grew and dust storms gathered on the horizon, the whisper spread through boardrooms and secret meetings alike. A nation on its knees can be reshaped. The blood is ready. The Great Depression was more than economic ruin. It was a test of belief. Factories closed, farms withered, banks dissolved, and faith in democracy wavered. In this chaos, Thornhill's descendants saw a familiar pattern: despair breeds obedience. Some embedded themselves in relief agencies, rising quickly through the layers of bureaucracy. They directed aid selectively, rewarding those who showed loyalty, punishing those who questioned. In towns where they operated, whispers spread of strange cliques who controlled food lines with near-religious authority. Others moved abroad, drawn to Europe where authoritarian ideologies were rising. Fascist rallies in Italy and Germany echoed Catherine's doctrine so perfectly: blood, destiny, hierarchy, that Thornhill inheritors felt as if they were hearing their own creed spoken back to them. At least 2 descendants, documented later in obscure intelligence files, attended Nazi gatherings in the early 1930s. They returned to America with new strategies: propaganda, spectacle, the manipulation of fear on a mass scale. But not all chose foreign soil. Within America, the Brood found fertile ground in industrial unrest. Strikes and riots offered them opportunities to pose as leaders, organizers, and even provocateurs. They whispered of new orders rising from collapse, of families and nations purified through struggle. Their language blurred politics with biology, always circling back to Catherine's lesson: blood above law. By the mid-1930s, the Thornhill vision had shifted from hidden parlors to public movements. What had begun in the locked basement of a Georgia plantation was now mirrored on podiums across the world. And the whisper was growing louder. World War II was the perfect storm for Catherine's legacy. Nations burned with ideology, armies marched under banners of purity and destiny, and blood itself became a justification for slaughter. For the Thornhill descendants, it was not just history unfolding, it was opportunity. Some aligned themselves with America's intelligence services, newly forming networks that would evolve into the OSS and later the CIA. They offered knowledge of European ideologues, presenting themselves as experts in racial psychology and manipulation of mass movements. In reality, they were embedding their ancestral doctrine into the very core of America's wartime strategy. Others took advantage of the chaos at home. Factories booming with wartime contracts became fertile ground for experiments in control. Thornhill bloodlines secured management positions, overseeing vast numbers of workers while quietly testing methods of obedience, timed rewards, calculated punishments, whispered rumors of surveillance. To them, the war was not only against foreign enemies, it was an experiment in molding populations through fear and scarcity. But the most chilling overlap came when records surfaced decades later, suggesting that certain descendants may have acted as intermediaries in Operation Paperclip, helping shepherd Nazi scientists into America after the war. Men who had experimented on prisoners in camps were granted safe passage, cloaked in secrecy, and placed into American institutions. The Thornhill inheritors saw no contradiction. To them, these scientists were kin in spirit, practitioners of the same creed Catherine had written in cipher a century earlier. War had not destroyed the bloodline's vision. It had magnified it. The Cold War was not only a clash of superpowers, it was a theater of control. Fear of annihilation kept populations pliant, and secrecy became the currency of power. For the Thornhill bloodline, this was their natural environment. Some descendants burrowed into the new alphabet agencies, CIA, NSA, DARPA, where surveillance was no longer whispered but institutionalized. Catherine's journals had spoken of keeping her brood obedient through fear and watchfulness. Now, entire nations were treated as her plantation once had been, monitored, catalogued, punished when they strayed, rewarded when they complied. Other heirs took root in academia and psychology. The 1950s saw an explosion of research into behavior modification, hypnosis, sensory deprivation, and chemical control. Projects like MKUltra were publicly disavowed, but privately pursued with relentless intensity. Thornhill inheritors, with their obsession for shaping generations, slipped easily into these programs. To them, human beings were still rootstock, still seedlings to be cultivated, manipulated, and broken. Meanwhile, their presence grew in corporate America. Fortune 500 boardrooms welcomed polished men and women who carried the cold Thornhill eyes, always advocating for efficiency over humanity, loyalty over liberty. They did not need plantations anymore. The economy itself became their field, and employees their new crop. The doctrine had adapted seamlessly. Catherine had bound flesh to soil, her descendants bound minds to systems, and the brilliance of it was this: most never saw the chains. They thought themselves free, while every choice had been anticipated, every rebellion already contained. By the 1960s, war and politics were not enough. To control a generation, one had to control its dreams, and so the Thornhill descendants turned their gaze toward culture. Music, film, literature. These became the new pulpits of doctrine. A song could stir rebellion, yes, but it could also guide it into predictable channels, ensuring that resistance never truly threatened the system. A film could present authority as either heroic or inevitable, softening the mind to accept surveillance, war, or conformity as natural facts of life. Thornhill heirs understood this before most, and they positioned themselves inside the studios, publishing houses and networks that shaped the American imagination. At the same time, academia birthed new social theories, many seeded with quiet hands. Ideas about identity, history, and freedom were debated endlessly, yet always circling within boundaries defined long before. Catherine's cipher spoke of seedlings shaped by light or shadow. Her descendants had perfected the art of casting that shadow while convincing the masses it was sunlight. Even the counterculture bore their fingerprints. Movements that seemed radical often collapsed inward, consumed by drugs, surveillance, or leaders who mysteriously imploded at critical moments. Was it coincidence, or careful pruning of a crop that had grown too wild? By the end of the decade, television had become the household altar, flickering images binding families together in narratives they did not choose. And behind some of those stories, some of those decisions, were the pale green eyes of Thornhill blood. When the digital revolution arrived, most saw liberation, instant communication, endless information, the illusion of choice. But to the Thornhill bloodline, it was something far more valuable: total visibility. Where Catherine had kept ledgers of seedings and births, her descendants now kept databases. Every purchase, every search, every conversation left a trail, and those trails were harvested with the same cold precision once reserved for breeding charts. The Plantation ledger had become the algorithm. They positioned themselves at the fulcrum of this transformation: investors in the early internet, advisors in telecommunications, architects of surveillance policy after each new crisis. While the public celebrated the wonders of connection, Thornhill heirs smiled quietly. A net that binds fish is strongest when the fish believe it is water. Social media too became their instrument. It promised expression, but it delivered profiling. It promised connection, but it delivered addiction. Catherine's doctrine was alive here. Her seedlings had once been bound by blood. Now billions were bound by dopamine, endlessly scrolling, endlessly distracted, never noticing the bars of the cage closing around them. Even rebellion had been digitized. Outrage was measured, channeled, and sold as data. Protests organized online were mapped, infiltrated, and contained. The plantation was now global, the overseer invisible, the harvest perpetual, and through it all the pale green eyes remained, hidden in boardrooms, think tanks, and encrypted nets. So we return to the question no historian dares to ask aloud: was Thornhill estate only a nightmare locked in the past, or was it the seed of something larger, something still shaping the world around us? Catherine Danforth Thornhill believed blood was destiny. She bound men, women, and children to her estate not only through law, but through flesh, through lineage, through poison and fear. When Union soldiers opened those iron doors in 1864, they thought they were ending a crime. In truth, they were only glimpsing the prologue. Her descendants carried the doctrine outward, into politics, into war, into science, into culture, into the very technologies we cradle in our hands each day. The plantation was never dismantled. It was scaled, abstracted, hidden beneath the illusion of progress. Today, you are not whipped or chained, but your attention is harvested, your movements tracked, your desires anticipated, your rebellions contained before they ignite. The Thornhill vision thrives because it has adapted. It no longer needs soil, nor cotton, nor even blood. It only needs obedience disguised as freedom. And the chilling truth is this: most men accept the yoke willingly. So I leave you with a final image. Catherine's children, huddled in the darkness of that Georgia basement, whispering, "Mistress says we are her legacy." Look around you now. Look at the systems you live within. Are you certain those words are not still true? The plantation did not vanish. It simply changed shape, until it became the world itself.